My name is Jim Lakely. I'm the Director of Communications at the Heartland Institute, and I appreciate you all being here in a very important subject in healthcare, and that is prescription drugs, making them easier to get, especially if you're terminally ill. And then you kind of take it beyond that. You know, the words right to try, they were mentioned, and we're going to see a clip of that in a minute from President Trump in a State of the Union address. And the Heartland Institute's been working with our friends and allies on this panel on this topic quite intensely for the last year or two. And so right to try is the idea that, well, if you're terminally ill, you're going to die, why not try a drug that can save your life, a drug that, for instance, might be available in Japan or Germany or Australia. We had actually a private meeting about this the other day, and while that's a good idea, and somebody who really has no other options left should not be prevented by government from trying to save their life. And I think it's an important place to start the conversation. But I think what you might learn from this discussion today, and I hope from the Q&A that follows, is that you shouldn't be at death's door to be able to take better care of yourself. You shouldn't be almost dead before you can try to save your life. There should be a way that you can even make your life better by your own choice and not having government get in the way. And that's why this panel, this breakout session is entitled Right to Try, which a lot of people are familiar with through the President's State of the Union address, but how that's just the start, and that there are other more free market, liberty-centric reforms that need to be made, not just to save lives, but to make people's lives better. And that's something the Heartland Institute is very happy to be working with our allies and friends on this panel and throughout the free market movement and the conservative movement to make happen. But you are not here to hear me speak. I am going to introduce each of our speakers in a moment. Actually, I'll just briefly introduce them right now. Our first speaker is going to be Starla Coleman. She is from the Goldwater Institute. There probably isn't an organization in the country that has done more to allow Americans to have the choice to choose drugs through consultations with their doctors and to get the governments and the bureaucrats out of the way than the Goldwater Institute. And so we're very happy to have Starlee here and to have the Goldwater Institute as an ally. To her right is a gentleman by the name of Bart Madden. He is he's into finance as his profession. He has worked to find ways to analyze very complex systems. That's how you can really figure out finances. But that kind of knowledge can also be applied to other complex systems like prescription drugs and their proper use and distribution. And he has a concept that he calls free-to-choose medicine, which is one of those things that is beyond right to try, and as I think something that people here might come out of this room pretty excited about. And so that's Bart Madden. He will be our second speaker. And last is Fred Rotor. Now, the reason I didn't read their proper introductions is because I have them written down, and it's kind of embarrassing to read them, and I didn't want to do it. But Fred is the managing director of the Consumer Choice Center. That's a nonprofit organization that represents consumers in over 100 countries across the globe. Their parent organization is Students for Liberty, which means they really are energetic, know what they're doing, and will be successful. And that's why we're very glad to have Fred here to give us more of an international perspective on this whole idea of having the right with your doctor to find drugs that can not only save your life, but make your life worth living. And with that, I am going to play a video at the request of our first speaker, Starla Coleman.
We also believe that patients with terminal conditions, terminal illness, should have access to experimental treatment immediately that could potentially save their lives. People who are terminally ill should not have to go from country to country to seek a cure. I want to give them a chance right here at home. It's time for Congress to give these wonderful, incredible Americans the right to try.
We could play more applause, but I think you get the point. Oops, pardon me, wrong. Okay, please welcome then to the lectern for her presentation, Starla Coleman.
Good afternoon, everyone. You're brave souls to be at a panel discussion on FDA reform at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon when I know you want to be at happy hour. So thanks for coming. We will try to make this snappy for everyone so we can keep your attention. I'm with the Goldwater Institute. My name is Starla Coleman, and we have been leading an effort over the past couple of years to have states and the federal government pass a law called Right to Try. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Right to Try is, why we think it's important, and then who else is behind it, and some kind of key things for you to know. So I'm going to start by telling you, I'm going to explain what Right to Try is by telling you the story through a couple of people that are key players in this discussion. This is Jordan Mclin. He's 7 years old. He lives in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he has a fatal form of muscular dystrophy called Duchenne. Duchenne, muscular dystrophy doesn't normally kill its victims, but Duchenne does. It normally kills children by the time they're 20 years old. So right now, Jordan is in the prime of his life at 7. He will get progressively weaker until he's basically unable to walk and suffers under the weight of his own chest. There are very few treatments for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and about 1 in 1,000 children is born with this disease. So Jordan right now is in a clinical trial, brand new clinical trial that just started. He's one of 15 children in the world in a trial. This is Diego Morris. Diego lives in Phoenix. He's 15 years old now. When he was 11, he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, which is a rare and fatal form of cancer. He was treated at St. Jude's Hospital in Memphis and quickly ran out of all available and approved treatment options. His family, both of his parents are lawyers. They have plenty of money. And one of his doctors said, "We really think you need to go to England to try a treatment that is legal in the UK and is one of the best treatments for osteosarcoma that is available anywhere in the world, but it's not available in the United States." So his family, because they had resources, were able to pick up and move and go to the UK for a year for Diego to be treated. He made it through his treatments. Today he's 15. He's a healthy teenager who's getting ready to start high school. This is Matt Bellina. He was a Navy fighter pilot. When he was 30 years old, he was diagnosed with ALS at 30. He's 33 today. He's already beating the life expectancy of people who are diagnosed with ALS, which is normally 2 years from diagnosis to death. So because he's young and healthy, he's okay, but he's getting worse every day. So whenever I email with Matt now, he tells me things like, "It's getting harder and harder for me to type, so you might want to call me instead." So for ALS, there hasn't been a new treatment on the market in the United States in 30 years. So this is what we're talking about with Right to Try. Right to Try lets people who have been diagnosed as terminally ill work with their doctors and drug companies to access drugs that are still in clinical trials. These drugs have to have passed a phase 1 clinical trial. That's the phase where the FDA says these drugs are safe enough to be used in broader clinical trials. So it has to have passed a phase 1 trial, be in an ongoing FDA-approved clinical trial that is testing effectiveness of the drug. So our point with this law is that if you are terminally ill, you have tried all of the options available to you, you are not eligible for a clinical trial, we think that you should have the right to decide for yourself, along with your doctor and a drug company that has something that they think might help you, if you're willing to take that risk. Right now, if you want to do that in the United States, you have to ask the FDA for permission. You have to file an application with the FDA to save your life. And the FDA can say no. We don't think that that's okay. One of the important things to know about Right to Try is that it's overwhelmingly bipartisan. It's passed in 38 states so far. 39, technically. It just passed in Wisconsin last night, overnight. We're waiting on the governor's signature there. In half of those states, it's passed unanimously in the House and the Senate. In Arizona, you can see that it was approved overwhelmingly by voters. Republican and Democrat governors are signing this bill. And importantly, last August, it passed the U.S. Senate unanimously. That never happens. The Senate can't pass any bills, much less anything unanimously. Right to Try is also safe. That's one of the things that we hear a lot, like one of the questions that people have. These are unapproved drugs and treatments. Are we sure that this is safe for patients? And the answer to that is it's the exact same drug that's being used in FDA-approved clinical trials. So if it's safe enough to be used in a clinical trial, then we think it's safe enough to be used by a terminally ill patient who understands the risk that it's unapproved and it may not work and it may not help them. We think they still have the right to make that choice for themselves. And it's also important to know that the right to try is a last resort. Right to try is for people who have been diagnosed as terminally ill, for people who have tried all other treatment options, for people who can't get into a clinical trial. I mean, this is it. This is the end of the line for these people. And when we see that there are drugs in the approval pipeline that could save someone's life, to have them walled off just because they haven't finished, the FDA approval process, which can take 15 years, we're not okay with that. It's kind of like saying if you were on a sinking ship, would you pass the only lifeboat because it hadn't been fully government certified? No. You would say, put the lifeboat in the water, and you'd get in it. And that's what Right to Try is. It puts the lifeboats in the water. Right to try is also totally voluntary, which is a really important principle in liberty, right? It's voluntary for the patient. No one is forced to take an investigational drug. It's voluntary for doctors. No doctor is required to pursue an investigational treatment for a patient that they think may not help them. And importantly, it's voluntary for drug companies. If a drug company is talking with a doctor and they think, you know what, this patient is not the right fit for this drug, or we're just not ready yet to share the drug widely, then they should have that right too, to say we're not ready. But when you have a patient who understands the risk, a doctor who thinks that the treatment could help them, and a drug company that's willing to provide it, the FDA should not get a veto stamp. And the most important thing is that Right to Try is working. As I mentioned earlier, 38 states have already adopted Right to Try laws. And we get letters all the time from patients who have been treated under Right to Try who tell us that they think a lot of the policies that the Goldwater Institute pursues are completely bonkers and nutty, but they really appreciate the Right to Try because they're alive today because of it. And that's a really powerful testament. This guy, Mark from California, the second from the right of the screen, his letter to us is completely hilarious. He said, the first thing is, you have to know, I think you guys are completely crazy. Everything you do is totally crazy, except for this. This is amazing. And he literally is alive today because this law passed. Right to Try not only gets overwhelming bipartisan support when it's actually up for a vote in a state legislature or in the U.S. Senate, it's also supported by organizations that range across the political spectrum. You'll see right there at the top, the president and the vice president are both extremely supportive of Right to Try. You saw the clip of the president mentioning the policy by name in his State of the Union, which we are proud to say was the only named legislative proposal that he actually spoke about. So that was quite an exciting and shocking evening. We also have groups like the American Conservative Union, the sponsor of CPAC, alongside groups like the Texas AFL-CIO. This is something that is common sense to regular people, getting the FDA out of the way when someone is dying. And we would invite you to stay engaged with us. Here's how you can find us online, righttotry.org. Right to Try on Facebook and _Right to Try on Twitter. We'd love to have you join our community, engage with us, ask questions, send us stories. One of the things that's amazing about this issue is that all of us have been touched by someone in our lives who has faced a terminal illness and not come out the other side. We all know what that feels like, and we all know what it would feel like to still have that person in our life, right? And if we can do one thing, if we can do something so that one person has the chance to spend a little bit more time with their grandkids or walk their daughter down the aisle, that's a good thing. So I will leave it there and be happy to answer. Do you want us to answer questions at the end?
At the end, yes.
Okay, great.
Great. Thank you, Starlee. Okay. This is bugging, so I'm just going to do it. There we go. All right. Sorry, the last letter of every one of your slides got cut off, Starlee.
It's okay.
I didn't want to do.
I think you guys know what I was trying to say, right? Yeah.
I didn't want to do an in-motion adjustment. But our next speaker, as you can see from the slide there about free to choose medicine, is Bart J. Madden. He retired as a managing director of Credit Suisse Holt after a career in investment research and money management that included the founding of Callard, Madden and Associates. His early research led to the development of the CFROI valuation framework that is used today by money management firms worldwide. His current research focuses on knowledge building and wealth creation as opposite sides of the same coin. One of his latest books, Value Creation Thinking, focuses on how creating long-term value begins with clarity as to the purpose of the firm and management's core responsibilities, and emphasizes the overriding importance of a knowledge-building culture. Knowledge building is the topic of another new book, Reconstructing Your Worldview, the 4 core beliefs you need to solve complex business problems. And one idea concerns systems thinking and identification of key constraints that degrade overall system performance. And an application of systems thinking to public policy is reflected in Madden's proposal to restructure, fundamentally, the Food and Drug Administration, which is explained, as he will explain right now, in his new book, Free to Choose Medicine, Better Drugs Sooner at a Lower Cost, the 3rd edition of which will be coming out very shortly. Please welcome to the stage Bart Madden.
Oops. Oh no, did I mess it up? No, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You just use these 2 fingers and these 2 things to advance the slides.
Okay. In order to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives, we need a high-performance drugs-to-patients system. Now, the goal of that system should be better drugs sooner at lower cost. Now, we're failing to achieve that goal. Now, one obvious bit of evidence is sky-high prescription drug prices, especially for serious illnesses. So, to fix the system, we need to fix the key constraint or the bottleneck in the system, which is the FDA's monopoly on access to new drugs and the FDA's relentless, continual demand for extremely expensive, both time and money, clinical trials. Now, less visible in this process are those patients who pay the ultimate cost, which is being denied access to a not yet approved drug that has real potential to extend their lives or even save their lives. So let's talk a little bit about those patients. This slide shows 11 patients that died from cancer, and they all tried to get a not yet approved drug that had genuine potential to extend or save their lives. Now, the girl in the middle is Abigail Burrows, the daughter of a very good friend of mine, Frank Burrows. Now, Abigail died at 21. She was valedictorian of her high school class, had an amazing future, and Frank tried to get her into a clinical trial for a drug, Erbitux, which was subsequently approved, but too late for Abigail. And the first time, her cancer was deemed to be in the wrong part of her body. She couldn't get in. The second time, they said she was too sick to enter a clinical trial. So what we're talking about here is not a modest incremental reform of the FDA. We're talking about a human tragedy that needs to be eliminated. Now, after Abigail died, Frank decided to devote the remaining life to, fighting for patients. So Frank formed the Abigail Alliance for Better Access to Developmental Drugs. Now, sometimes there's an unspoken assumption in the room. If the room has strong FDA proponents for the status quo, that assumption is that you and I are not smart enough to work with our doctors and make an informed decision about the use of a not yet approved drug. Now, that's simply false. The Abigail Alliance, in the last 16 years, they've fought for access to 40 drugs using partial information, not the type of comprehensive information that Free to Choose Medicine would bring. Now, 40 out of 40 drugs were subsequently approved by the FDA. So I think we're smart enough to deal with our own health decisions. The third edition of this Free to Choose Medicine book should be out sometime in the middle of March, I believe. And the book has a foreword from Vernon Smith, the economist who won the Nobel Prize partly for his work in deregulating markets. Now, Vernon made an important statement that I'd like to read. He says that Free to Choose Medicine is a system to promote decentralized responses close to the local knowledge that is available to physicians and their patients, but not to the FDA. In other words, Free to Choose Medicine is based on sound economic principles, and it is a practical plan to achieve better drugs sooner at lower cost. Now, as to practicality, about 10 years ago, there was an early version of Free to Choose Medicine. At that time, we called it dual tracking. And Heartland published a booklet which was translated into 7 foreign languages, one of which was Japanese. And at that time, I talked to Mr. Yu, who actually currently runs the Japanese for Tax Reform. It's a free market think tank in Japan. And he said, we're going to make this translation, and he would personally give this booklet to each and every member of Japan's governing body. And I lost track of this, to be honest. Well, November 2013, the equivalent of Free to Choose Medicine was passed in Japan. It's for regenerative medicine drugs, but it's a major, beachhead in the whole freedom of choice movement. So I don't know how important this booklet was, but the important thing is that the train has left the station as far as freedom of choice goes. So what do you think is happening in Japan right now? Regenerative medicine quite often is involved with stem cell treatments. So right now there's 6 or 8 drugs, many of which are stem cell treatment drugs, accessible to Japanese individuals that have generated safety evidence and some likelihood of efficacy. So what is happening is, around the world, if you're a drug developer in stem cells, you want to get yourself over to Japan. Capital is flowing in a major way to Japan. Now, what's interesting is that did the Japanese make a scientific breakthrough in stem cell treatments? No. They made a breakthrough, a regulatory breakthrough is what they did. Now, there are 3 core principles of free-to-choose medicine. The first is a free-to-choose track operated independently of the FDA. In this slide, if you look at the top panel, you'll see after preclinical work, a drug selected for clinical trials goes through phase 1, which is a safety trial. Then it gets into phase 2, safety and efficacy. Then phase 3, typically randomized controlled trials. Then the developer, if the data is good enough, applies for an NDA, a new drug application. This process will take about 10 to 12 years for a drug developer to get through it, and the approximate cost is $2.5 billion. That includes the cost of failed drugs and the capital cost involved. Now, by the way, if you look at this, think of it as a pipeline. What's coming out the pipeline after 10 or 12 years is an approved drug. We all know that medical innovation is growing at an exponential rate in terms of understanding of biology and the human genome. So the drugs that are in the early part of this 10 to 12 year pipeline, they will be obsoleting the approved drugs. So wouldn't it be nice to have freedom of choice so you could access early on and make a choice on these most innovative new treatments? The way it would work is that after a drug has successfully passed phase 1 safety trials, 1 or more phase 2 trials, then a drug developer could petition a Free-to-Choose Medicine Advisory Committee to sell their drug on the free-to-choose track. Now, importantly, the free-to-choose track would be operated independently of the FDA. Very, very important. This is a market-based system. If a free-to-choose drug is out there, treatment results we'll talk about, are available to you and your doctor. If that drug does better than approved drugs, usage would accelerate. If that drug does poorly, usage would drop off. It's a market-based system. Now, I mentioned that the train left the station with Japan. If freedom of choice is the new environment, and it is coming, what should we expect to see? Well, we should expect businesses to start operating which can exploit this new environment. Now, in the Netherlands is a company. It's called My Tomorrows. The CEO is Ron Bruce, a very capable CEO. And previously, he started up a biotech company and sold it to Johnson & Johnson for $2.4 billion. Ron's a very smart guy. So I asked him, tell me about My Tomorrows. He said, look, I'm CEO of a major biotech company. My father came down with stage 2 lung cancer. There's a drug out there which by everyone agrees is the best treatment, but it's not yet approved. He said, I'm a CEO of a biotech company. I could not get that drug for my father before he died. So My Tomorrows is a company that acts as a middleman outside the U.S. They deal with patients, drug developers, drug manufacturers, and handle all the paperwork. So let me read to you a quote from Ron Bruce because it hits the nail on the head about what free-to-choose medicine is all about. There is only one reason why a good drug is expensive: the 15 years taken to develop it. The molecule itself is not expensive. If we continue down the current route, the process will only become more expensive. But if we introduce drugs earlier to the first patient, they will become cheaper and more patients will benefit. Introducing a drug to a surrogate market earlier will also create more competition, thus bringing down costs and encouraging new drugs. Actors who benefit from the current system do not want change, but patients will ultimately win as they are the consumers. Healthcare is consumerizing so rapidly today that for the first time, patients truly understand what the process of drug development entails. The internet and social media have helped patients enormously in terms of accessing information. Finally, society's growing access to data changes the world, and the pharma industry should not be the exception. Okay, the second key component is a trade-off evaluation drug database, or nicknamed TED. Here's how it would work. You and your doctor would be able to access TED, and it would contain clinical trial results for approved drugs, plus up-to-date treatment results for not yet approved drugs that are on the free-to-choose track. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a self-adjusting system. So what would happen is, as this data is in real time is being reported, the treatment results would include genetic makeup and biomarkers. So what you would be able to discover is that subsets of patients identified typically with their genetic makeup could do extraordinarily well or even poorly with a free-to-choose drug. Now that is incredibly valuable information. So you and your doctor could find out if you're a member of one of those subsets. Here again, all of this is happening real time, very, very fast, entirely different than the current system. So now everyone is concerned about innovation with pharma. TED would be a treasure trove of information for the pharmaceutical industry to make better R&D decisions. Now, oftentimes we hear that what we really want is radical out-of-the-box innovation, not me-too drugs that incrementally get out there that barely change the standard of care. So if you think of the classic small biotech company, let's just say they got all the scientific talent in the world, and they've come up with a radical, out-of-the-box, different way of approaching Alzheimer's or what have you. They try and raise capital. I'm a venture capitalist. I look at you, the small biotech company, and what do I see? 10 to 12 years from now, after I give you my money, we're going to find out what kind of the statistical milestones the FDA will demand for this radical out-of-the-box innovation. We know the FDA is overly cautious all the time, so if something is truly, truly innovative, they're going to demand incredibly difficult milestones. So I may like your science, but the business risk of this long regulatory overload is just too much. So the cost of capital gets enormously high for the most innovative companies that we want capital to flow to. Now, we have the current commissioner of the FDA, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, really smart guy. He gets it. Let me read a brief quote about cost of capital from Scott Gottlieb, our FDA commissioner. The cost of capital is affected the most by the risk of failure. As the risk of failure grows, entrepreneurs seek a higher potential return in order to support the initial investment. The cost of capital is also significantly impacted by the time it will take to develop a new medicine. In a dynamic and competitive market, the capital needed to fund a new drug program is always competing against the next best economic use of that money. free-to-choose medicine would dramatically lower the cost of capital to smaller developmental companies, because instead of 10 to 12 years, after approximately 3 or perhaps 4 years, if their drug works, if the science works, they would generate data showing that actual real-world patients are getting better with this drug, and that would solve their capital problem. Now, the third leg of the stool is observational approval. In other words, TED would deal with observational data, safety and efficacy results of real-world patients' treatment results in use, a heterogeneous sample. And a free-to-choose medicine bill would empower the FDA, if the observational data is compelling, to grant an alternative approval. And that would be a big carrot to get drug developers to participate in the free-to-choose track. It also would be an incentive for insurance companies to reimburse for the use of these free-to-choose drugs. So let me summarize what we're talking about here. Freedom of choice, increasing choice, decreasing regulatory costs, increasing innovation, increasing competition, not just competition for the FDA's regulatory process, but heightened competition for the pharmaceutical companies. And the result would be a decline in drug prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Okay, our last speaker before questions, and then there'll be some closing remarks and maybe even more questions, and then we're off to, as Starlee mentioned, happy hour, which is certainly nice, and the Reagan dinner tonight. I hope a lot of you here are going to that. But Frederick Rotor is Managing Director of the Consumer Choice Center. That's a nonprofit organization that represents consumers in over 100 countries across the globe. Fred has been working in the field of grassroots activism for over 8 years. He's a health economist from Germany and has worked in healthcare reform and market access in North America, Europe, and several former Soviet republics. So he knows control and command systems for sure. One of his passions is to analyze how disruptive industries and technologies allows consumers more choice at a lower cost. And since 2012, he serves as an associate researcher with the Montreal Economic Institute. Please welcome for his presentation, Frederick Rotor.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Many interesting things have already been said, but I would just like to give some perspective on what it actually means to deal with a behemoth regulator such as the FDA or its counterparts in other parts of the world, because I'm also pretty sure that even though Japan might be a bit smart on certain things, there are probably also patients which are deprived of easier or faster access to medicine thanks to bureaucrats. And I think maybe I will also talk a bit more about the reason why smaller companies and smaller teams of innovators have a massive problem to actually have a market-ready product, for instance, a drug for patients. So since the pharmaceutical industry, and I've been working almost the last decade with and for pharmaceutical companies as a consultant mainly. It's a very specific industry, and I just want to explain a bit how the industry is structured and where the industry actually makes money. So there is this term, big pharma. Pharma itself doesn't like to hear it. It's a bit like big tobacco. Tobacco would also never call themselves big tobacco. Both of them also don't really like each other, but they have some similarities. So they're basically in the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world. 5 are from the US and 5 are from Europe, mainly Switzerland, France, the UK, and a bit of Germany. And in the top 20 pharmaceutical companies, among the top 20 pharmaceutical companies, you have 10 American companies and 10 European companies. So it's basically a US-European industry, no Canadians, no Russians, no Chinese, also no Japanese, or at least not in the top 20 players. And top 20 is quite a lot. That's just the top 20 have roughly an annual turnover of somewhere around $700 billion. That's probably so it's a lot of money. That's close, I think, to your annual deficit, right? That's around $1 trillion. Whereas it's a lot of money, just to put it in comparison. And then there are much more pharma companies. But the interesting thing is that about 50% or 41% of the global revenue or sales made by pharma are made in this country, in the US. So 5% of the global population costs actually 41% of the revenues. So it's by far the most important market is the US market. Even more important, not just looking at revenue, but actually profits, and that's at the end of the day when a business counts. More than 50% of global profits are made in the US. Yeah, so every cent change of a price of a drug in the US has massive implications for a pharma company, no matter if that's the American company Johnson & Johnson or it's the Swiss company Roche. The US market is by far the most important market. And that's probably why also lots of these companies don't really want to start a fight with that body which gives you either approval or doesn't approve your drug in this market, because that's 50% of your global business. And this is crucial for survival to be good in this business. If a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, you start a war with the FDA and you lose it, probably your board will let you go very quickly. Because shareholders don't really like that. But now it's very interesting to see that Japan apparently is a bit smarter when it comes to actually letting patients choose and giving quicker access to innovative and life-saving medicine. You would think, okay, Japan, that's really far away, and it's an obscure market, and they have weird TV shows in Japan, so who cares? You cannot compare Japan to the US. Well, actually, when it comes to the global pharma market, you can, because the second largest pharmaceutical market in the world is Japan. About 10 to 12% of global sales are made in Japan, and about 20% of global profits are made in Japan. So Japan, with a population of 125, 130 million, actually brings in more profits in absolute terms than 500 million of Europeans. So Japan is the second largest market in the world, and even combined, the European Union with 500 million population does not bring in as much profits to the profit and loss statements of pharma companies than Japan. So Japan is a very significant market, and apparently this very significant second largest pharmaceutical market in the world was able to apply a certain amount of innovation in the approval system, which is good news. And even though there is currently not a single Japanese player in the global top 20 pharmaceutical companies, thanks to this very innovative regulatory regime in Japan when it comes to drug approval and giving patients access to drugs, more and more investments, and this is what Dr. Madden already said, more and more investments are being made into Japanese companies. European and American companies start acquiring smaller Japanese biotech companies. They start having more trials over there. And also the Japanese companies themselves, they start growing. So you should not be surprised if in 10 years in the global top 10 of pharma companies, there might be 3 or 4 Japanese companies. This happens pretty quickly, because if you look at the portfolio of pharma companies, usually they have 3, 4, or 5 blockbusters. These are the drugs they actually make money with. And if they expire, their revenues go heavily down. You can go on the Wikipedia page, actually, of the top pharma companies. I think it's the top 20 chart. And you see every year there are massive ups and downs. It's a bit like an NBA league chart. It's not always the same company being the global champion, because the patent protections also expire, and then you need to come up with a new product. And so far, this mainly happens by acquiring smaller biotech companies, which actually have very promising research. But these companies can actually not afford to cope with bureaucracies such as the FDA. So probably, regulators often talk about antitrust laws, and we are not allowed to get companies so large, and that's bad for consumers. Well, actually, the best antitrust policy probably is to reduce the market entry barriers. And the massive market entry barrier in actually getting a drug market-ready approval is coping with regulators such as the FDA. Because that's really expensive, and big pharma companies, like the really big ones, like the Johnson & Johnsons and the Amgens of the world, which are great companies, and they have products on the market that are life-saving. Millions of people are saved every year, maybe even billions, thanks to pharmaceutical companies. They do a great thing. But these really large companies, they actually don't innovate so much, but they have this massive bureaucracy administration that can actually deal with the government bureaucracy on the other side. Whereas a small biotech company with 200 researchers and maybe one lawyer on team, they could never do that, so they need to team up with the big ones just to comply with what's needed to bring a drug to the market. And that really is probably one of the main drivers of cost for drugs, and it kills lots of innovation in the early stage, because some of these biotech companies don't get acquired by the big ones. They basically just they get bankrupt, and maybe the research is not being picked up for the next decade, which means for the next decade more people die from a disease we could have maybe potentially cured. So I think there are also no sound numbers on how much research just vanishes because of compliance cost. It's hard to measure, but one can assume that it is a pretty high number. So basically, one fairly easy fix for some of these problems is to expose regulators such as the FDA to competition. It's probably really hard to reform a massive regulator with, you said 16,000 bureaucrats? Yeah, with 16,000 bureaucrats, to reform that from inside, because there's so much resistance and inertia, and you could have the most dedicated politicians to change something, but the moment, I'm not sure if you watched Yes Minister, this show from the 80s from the UK, so you can have the most motivated politician, the moment the politician hits bureaucrats or faces bureaucrats, things get complicated, because bureaucrats are pretty good at maintaining the status quo. But one way to change things is actually by saying, well, okay, we have the FDA, but there are also some other large drug administrations out there. For instance, the European Medicines Agency and the Japanese regulator. I don't know their name, but the Japanese Medicines Agency. And why don't we allow American patients to actually also say, well, if something is safe in Japan, maybe it's also safe for me. It's a developed country. The same for Europe. I mean, if a drug is being prescribed and allowed and approved in Germany, and it's not that you don't read in the news that tens of thousands of Germans dying because of that, why shouldn't it be tried by US patients? And then suddenly the FDA sees, oh, actually companies don't really ask for approval through the FDA anymore. And that's like, I mean, these approval processes are expensive, and the FDA charges fees for this, I believe. Or that's yes. There's huge fees. So it's not all paid by taxpayers' money. I mean, there's taxpayers' money going into it, but these approval bodies also charge the companies for the approval processes. And the moment they have less companies actually asking for approval, the revenues of this agency goes down, and then these bureaucrats suddenly get worried and need to actually compete with a better way of coping or walking through these approval services. I use an example, for instance, ride sharing. I mean, taxis. I remember actually the first couple of times I came to Washington, D.C., 2008, 2009, you really did not want to sit in a taxi. I mean, they were really old cars and terrible drivers, and they didn't want to drive you across the river, and it was like very, very complicated. And then Uber and Lyft entered the market, and they have very, very good solutions, but the taxis themselves also had to improve and accept credit cards and actually have a bit newer cars, because otherwise no one would ever use one of these taxis. I mean, I haven't used a taxi for a long time, but people use them again, and you see, especially in large US cities, how the quality even of licensed taxis has improved because of the external competitive pressure coming in from Uber and Lyft. And you could see the same if you, for instance, have certain reciprocity agreements by also respecting drug approvals from Europe or Japan in the US. The FDA would have to change its strategy and actually become much more lean and less bureaucratic. I don't want to say unbureaucratic because it's a bureaucracy. So probably competition and reducing market entry barriers are 2 points how innovation and faster access to innovations can be realized. Thank you.